There is something about Chicago in the 1970s that people who lived through it can't forget. The earth-toned colors in living rooms, the steady rumble of the L overhead, the rise of disco and soul drifting from neighborhood clubs. These memories remain vivid for anyone who called the city home. It was a decade marked by factory closures, rising crime, and shrinking city budgets, yet also by remarkable resilience. Sears Tower climbed into the skyline in 1973, reminding Chicagoans that their city still reached higher than most. Families navigated shifting neighborhoods, economic uncertainty, and the challenges of urban life, all while holding on to the pride that defined Chicago's character. For older Americans who lived through those years, the 1970s were not just a chapter in history. They were a lived reality of struggle, music, community, and survival. Let's step back into that unforgettable time. The Chicago of the 1970s unfolded under pressures that shaped nearly every corner of daily life. As the decade progressed, factories that had powered the city's economy for generations began to close, leaving thousands of workers without stable jobs. Deindustrialization spread through steel mills, machine plants, and manufacturing districts, weakening the economic backbone that many families depended on. At the same time, the city's budget crisis strained public services. Streets, schools, and infrastructure began to show visible signs of neglect. Politically, Chicago remained under the firm control of the Democratic machine, with Mayor Richard J. Daley exerting a level of influence few American mayors have ever matched. His leadership brought administrative continuity, but it also deepened controversy during a time of rising tension. Crime rates climbed, racial inequality persisted. And many neighborhoods felt the combined weight of economic decline and social division. These forces defined the landscape that Chicagoans had to navigate each day. Yet beyond the headlines and the shifts in power, life in Chicago was lived street by street and home by home. To understand how people truly experienced the decade, we have to step away from the broader forces and look closely at the everyday rhythms that shaped their routines. Let's walk into the neighborhoods, onto the porches, and inside the homes where Chicagoans faced the challenges of the 1970s with determination and a sense of community that held them together. Daily life in Chicago during the 1970s was shaped as much by the homes people lived in as by the neighborhoods that surrounded them. Brick 3 flats lined entire blocks, their porches worn smooth by generations of families coming and going. Inside, earth-tone colors filled living rooms. Wood paneling darkened the walls. Vinyl records stacked beside color televisions that had quickly become household fixtures. In many South Side and West Side neighborhoods, years of economic decline were impossible to ignore. Buildings aged without repairs. Vacant lots opened where homes once stood. Streets reflected the strain of a city struggling to keep up. Yet on the North Side, new energy began to take hold as young professionals, artists, and LGBTQ+ communities moved into emerging enclaves. Family life shifted as well. Many white families left for the suburbs. Black and Latino households often lived in tighter quarters, sometimes with multiple generations sharing the same flat. For countless residents, the contrast between the nightlife that sparkled after dark and the worn streets they walked each morning was a defining part of the decade's rhythm. Getting around Chicago in the 1970s carried its own unmistakable rhythm. The city streets were filled with the long, heavy cars of the era. Ford LTDs, Chevrolet Impalas, Oldsmobile Cutlasses, vehicles that seemed almost oversized against the aging infrastructure. But more than anything, Chicago moved to the sound of the elevated trains. The L rattled above intersections, curved around buildings, and carried workers, students, and families through every season. Its steady clatter was a constant presence, comforting to some, intrusive to others, but always part of daily life. When the 1973 oil crisis drove gas prices sharply upward, many residents leaned more heavily on public transit. Trains and buses remained reliable even as roads cracked and congestion increased. Pollution often settled over the city on humid days, a reminder of how strained the environment had become. Still, for most Chicagoans, the act of moving through the city, whether by car or by train, was simply part of the routine they adapted to. The way people traveled reflected both the challenges and the character of the decade. Before we continue with the music, culture, and unforgettable landmarks that shaped Chicago in this era, if you are enjoying this look back and want to explore more stories from the decades many of you lived through, consider subscribing. There is so much more to revisit about how Americans built their lives, their neighborhoods, and their memories during times that now feel both distant and familiar. Music and culture defined Chicago in ways that helped many people make sense of a difficult decade. The city pulsed with the sounds of Chicago soul, funk, and disco, carried by artists whose influence reached far beyond local clubs. Earth, Wind, and Fire, founded in Chicago, brought an energy and sophistication that reshaped popular music. Curtis Mayfield wrote with a clarity that reflected both hope and hardship, and Chaka Khan's voice became a powerful symbol of individuality and pride. Fashion echoed the era's boldness: bell-bottoms, wide collars, leather jackets, large sunglasses, afros and natural curls, expressing identity and confidence. Television remained a nightly anchor. Families gathered around CBS, NBC, or ABC, relying on familiar programs to bring steadiness after long days. As the decade progressed, nightlife offered escape. Basement discos on the South Side, soul clubs filled with dancers, downtown bars with live music. These spaces let people forget, even briefly, the uncertainty waiting outside. Here, Chicago found a heartbeat strong enough to carry its residents through the challenges of the 1970s. Amid the uncertainty of the decade, Chicago's defining landmarks stood as reminders of the city's enduring identity. When the Sears Tower opened in 1973, rising higher than any building in the world, it sent a clear message. Chicago still saw itself as a place of ambition and possibility. For many residents, Lake Michigan offered daily relief. Summers along the shoreline brought families together on beaches and piers, giving them a break from the heat and pressure of city life. Wrigley Field remained a beloved constant. Cubs fans, loyal, patient, accustomed to heartbreak, kept traditions alive even during difficult seasons. Across the South Side, soul clubs and blues bars preserved the cultural heartbeat that set Chicago apart, and the elevated trains looping through the skyline added their unmistakable signature to the landscape. These places and sounds formed the backdrop of Chicago's character, anchoring the city through a decade of profound change. Food in 1970s Chicago reflected the city's working-class spirit and the comfort people sought during uncertain times. Deep dish pizza remained a local favorite, served in heavy pans fit for hearty appetites. Chicago-style hot dogs, Italian beef sandwiches, polished sausages, everyday staples found at neighborhood stands and busy street corners. Diners offered affordable breakfasts, coffee, pancakes, eggs. Simple meals that matched the routines of workers and families. Fast food expanded rapidly. McDonald's, Burger King, White Castle. Reliable options for households facing tight budgets. The foods people turned to were bold, filling, and connected deeply to Chicago life. A culinary identity that remains unmistakably Chicagoan. Life in Chicago during the 1970s carried a weight that many residents still remember. As factories closed and jobs disappeared, entire neighborhoods faced economic hardship that reshaped families and communities. Crime rose sharply, especially across the South and West Sides. Racial inequality in housing and employment persisted, limiting opportunities for Black and Latino residents. Infrastructure aged, streets cracked, buildings fell into disrepair. Fires became more common in neglected areas. reinforcing the sense that Chicago was struggling to keep up. For families who had depended on manufacturing work for generations, the uncertainty of the decade felt deeply personal. Yet through these challenges, people adapted. They supported one another, held on to traditions, and found ways to navigate a city undergoing profound change. The hardships of the 1970s left a lasting imprint, shaping how Chicagoans understood resilience and community. What ultimately defined Chicago in the 1970s was survival. Through factory closures, rising crime, and racial and economic division, Chicagoans learned to endure challenges that changed the city in lasting ways. Yet even in the hardest years, daily moments anchored life. The sound of the L echoing through the streets, the glow of soul clubs after dark, the smell of deep dish pizza drifting from restaurants, the familiar routines of families doing their best to move forward. The decade's contrasts were unforgettable. Nightlife that sparkled with music and energy, set against mornings revealing cracked sidewalks and aging homes. Still, people held on to pride and a sense of belonging that no hardship could take away. The 1970s left Chicago tougher, more self-reliant, and deeply aware of its own identity. And for those who carry memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.